Okay, that should be recording. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Tile Network seminar in March 2026, in case you look at this later on. Today, we are going to, we welcome Kirk Hilsey, and he will be talking about the lecture capture paradox. Just a very short, brief bio, and I'm just going to read it out, Kirk, because that's how you submitted it, and that's what's going to happen now. So he has a BSc in physiology and a PhD in neurophysiology from Sheffield University, UK. He postdoced in the USA, was a research director at a small Canadian biotech company, a lecturer at Ontario Institute of Technology, and is now a lecturer at Trent University, Ontario. His subtle research on lecture capture started in 2023 and emerged from the COVID pandemic. His talk today is on the lecture capture paradox, disentangling the benefits and drawbacks of in-person lecture recordings. And before I hand over to Kirk, I'm going to hand over to Professor Emily Nordman, who's going to give a very brief motivation for, because she actually nominated him as a speaker for today's Tile Talk. Emily.
Thank you very much. One of the papers, one of the data sets that Kirk is going to present today is from a paper that I read last year. It was last year, wasn't it? Yeah, time has no meaning anymore. Those of you who know me will know that I don't give up praise easily. It was one of the best papers on lecture capture I think I have ever read. That is because a lot of the scholarship literature is very descriptive. It's theoretical, and also some of the statistics will make some of my scite people cry. The thing that I love so much about Kirk's paper, and I don't agree with everything that Kirk has written, but the thing I really, really enjoyed about it is that it's really strongly theoretically motivated and based in self-regulation theory, and also the modelling that Kirk has done is particularly sophisticated. So no pressure, Kirk, but I'm very much looking forward to you presenting this work and then the follow-up. So I'm very delighted to have Kirk here and hope we get to work together at some point in the future.
Thank you, both Emily and Carolina, for the invitation and for the introduction. Just let me know when the slides are showing up.
Yeah, they're loading.
Okay, got some thumbs up.
Yes.
So as you can probably tell, from England originally, after various perambulations, ended up in Ontario for the last 20 odd years. And as was mentioned, this is very much a new research passion of mine that has very much come about through or because of the COVID pandemic, or the end of the COVID pandemic. And note here that I'm in the biology department, and one of the courses that I teach within the biology department is a third-year epidemiology course. So given that context, after the end of the last lockdown, and we went back to fully in person, I've just recorded all my in-person lectures, because although the lockdown was ended, the pandemic was still trundling along, as pandemics will do, and I felt quite hypocritical to force students to come to in-person lectures if they were still sick, etc., which was going on. And so that was really my main motivation. And to be perfectly honest, I've just viewed lecture capture as could only be a positive. That what on earth could be the downside, and I really at that time hadn't read up on any of the literature on lecture capture, etc., and I really was quite naive going into this process. And so I now obviously sorry, I'm having trouble advancing onto my Okay, just click on that. So obviously public health was my main motivation, but then obviously I became immediately aware that there were many other potential positives: student flexibility, accessibility, various EDI issues, etc. By the end of, or the middle of the first semester of teaching, with recording all lectures and posting those, I also became very aware of firsthand of some of the potential downsides of lecture capture. And in short, my attendance was typically about 10% at most, which I'm sure most of you can appreciate. Lecturing in a big lecture theatre to about 10 people is not my idea of fun. So this obviously then became made me practically quite aware that that is one of the big potential drawbacks of low attendance, and certainly within the literature, one of the most frequently cited issues of why people might not want to record their lectures and post them, and obviously this bigger issue of potentially disincentivizing students. And so with that experience, then I first of all, had this big question: well, am I actually really, putting the public health issue aside, am I actually really doing a sort of a service to the students, or am I doing them a disservice? So net benefit. So my first study was in this 23-24 year to look at the data that I had available to me on to try and get a first look at this question. And so I looked at and got data from my 3 biggest courses, which are all about 100 students. And they're all set up essentially exactly the same, that there are 10 2-hour lectures. The lectures are in person, and then we use Zoom at Trent here for all of the lecture recordings. And again, kind of as a leftover from COVID, where I took my sole midterm and split it into sort of smaller, more manageable I would call them tests, basically. That I continued that on as well, so that I had 2 midterms and a final. And importantly, to understand that in each of these courses, the exams were entirely independent and non-cumulative. And what that allowed me to do then was look at both how students did in different exams, where they might have different viewing habits for the lectures associated with each of the different exams. Okay, and so then I could obviously have exam grades. I could also then look at the Zoom viewing metrics. And just to give you an idea, then this is kind of what I had. So I could see in total which lectures were viewed, and obviously associated with which exam, how many unique views there were, the total view time, and when they viewed it in relation to when that lecture was being examined. And you can see, again, reminder that for each of these courses, I've got the same student taking 3 different exams with 3 different exam percentage, and then their different viewing habits. Okay, and so this then allowed me to look at the data in sort of a number of different ways. So starting just with the sort of the basic descriptive statistics. First thing to note is that the majority of students did take advantage of the lecture recordings, and that in total, if we just look at the percentage here, you can see about half of the lectures, both in duration and the total number of lectures, were viewed, and this and the final other metric is the timing of when they do it. To the surprise, I'm sure, of no one, it was very close to the exam. Typically, hardly anyone ever watched the lectures sort of in the week after that they were actually released. And to further give a bit of descriptive for there, about 54% of all of the viewing of the Zoom videos were actually on the day of the exam or the day before. Again, I'm shock horror, I'm sure, to most of you. So then coming on to the actual, the other main important thing, what was the actual difference in the exam performance? So first of all, just looking at, again, delineating between viewers and non-viewers, as you can see here, there was approximately about a 6 and a bit % difference in the exam performance in viewers versus non-viewers. And so this is just illustrated here, so 6.7%. And now, so obviously, we need to be very cautious in any of the interpretation of this because, you know, this is just an observational study. This does not mean that this is any causal effect of viewing. But in general, we can, if we think about this, my interpretation of this is that there is at least 2 different potential explanations for this initial sort of difference in exam performance. The first being that the viewings, the students who chose to view the lecture recording videos are actually inherently different in some way, shape or form to non-viewers. And then the second is that there could be some potential benefit for at least some of the students. And it's important to note that these are not mutually exclusive, okay, that both of these or neither of these could be true. So if we look at this and look at this same descriptive behavior or data in a slightly different way, just by now grouping the students according to their average exam performance in their particular exam, and hopefully you can all appreciate here that we've got on the y-axis the total view time and of it over for an exam lecture period, and then their mean exam score. And you can see, I've just sort of drawn this over, you can see there is this general relationship between the more that the lectures or more recordings that the students are viewing, the better their exam score is. And obviously, again, we need to be cautious that this isn't necessarily causal, but that is some line of evidence that LC viewing may be able to help some students. However, let me complete my graph, and you can see the top performing students that are getting 90 plus in their exams. You can see a bucking that trend. And again, to give some flesh to that data, if we look at this, 38% of the students never watched any of the lecture capture videos, and I just know, because it was only a handful of students that are making up that 38%, that anecdotally that they all attended lecture religiously and were sort of sat in the front row, you know, the students. And so obviously it's important then to establish that, you know, there's nothing special about lecture capture. It's just a tool that can be utilized, and it's one of many potential study strategies that can be beneficial to different students employing different strategies. Okay, so just want to come back to our example data table and remind ourselves that for each student, I've got 3 different observations of the same student. In addition, hopefully you can appreciate that there is quite a high degree of collinearity between some of the Zoom viewing metrics. And so for a combination of both those reasons, the only real appropriate method of analysis that certainly, as far as I'm aware, it was to use a linear mixed effects model. And this is something that was a big learning curve for me, what was new to me. It's quite common in certain areas, particularly in ecology, but I'm not an ecologist. And so just as a very brief, to give you an idea of what this is, effectively, it's a form of multiple regression that incorporates both fixed effects. So a fixed effect would be the impact of viewing lecture videos, but also random effects. So if each of these lines was a grades from all of one student, where we've got repeated observations, that accounts for random effects. Okay, and so then it allows then that analysis of multiple predictors. So we've got multiple different Zoom variables and allows for effectively trying to isolate them. In other words, working out the impact of the total viewing time, for example, when all of the other variables are being held constant. So that's just a very brief Coles Notes version of linear mixed effects models that then was the main analysis that I use for these studies. And so this gives us effectively then so for all of the exams, so we had about 320 students, each taking 3 exams, and effectively then the beta value is our value, the coefficient, that slope line, if you will, the regression line, and obviously we've got a p-value here. So you can see the main thing that I've highlighted here in this initial table is that the most significant impact was the total view duration, so the total for a particular exam, so over on average a 3 lecture block. The total time that they viewed the lectures, that was positively correlated to the exam performance. And this is basically plotted all the raw data here. So the trend line showing for all of the exams, and then this is the same data, but only considering the viewers only. So you can see all of the 0 dots are not included, but other than that, it is the same data. So you can see, obviously, there, as you might predict, there is a huge variety and students, you know, in terms of their viewing habits, etc. But there is, holding all other of the variables constant, the biggest significant impact was that total view duration. Okay, and just to put it into some sort of practical function that the model predicts was that for every hour of viewing lecture videos, that was associated with a 1.7% increase in the exam grade. Now, of course, remember, this is just a model of prediction. Again, we need to be careful with causal language here. So if we look at what else, you'll see I've included the number of unique views, which was nearing significance, a number of days before exam. I'm somewhat surprised initially this didn't come up, but I think a lot of it was because the data was very lopsided, and this I think probably had an impact on the statistics. But anyway, the other thing that I noticed, or that came out in the mixed effects model, was there was a negative correlation with the number of lectures viewed. And I'm sure many of you might be having the same kind of reaction that I had initially. And effectively, what's going on here? Now, the important thing here to understand is that the number of lectures viewed is when all of the other variables are being held constant. In other words, let's just use our specific example. If 2 students both watch 2 hours of lecture capture videos, the model predicts that the student who viewed 1 lecture in depth would score higher than the student who watched parts of 3 lectures. Okay, so it's that holding the total time being constant, then that kind of now makes sense, hopefully. Okay, and so it's not saying that a student that is watching more lectures and more total time, that is not what the model is predicting. It's only if the total lecture view time being held constant, then that sort of viewing it in depth versus only sort of viewing a bit of one lecture is where the deficit occurs. And so this then is again the raw data from here, and this is a slope line that is predicted by the model for when the total lecture view time is being held constant. But as I'm sure you can see, oh, I've just realized that I've actually uploaded a earlier version of my slides, where in the new version, which it doesn't matter, but effectively the actual raw fit of the trend line, as you can probably guess, actually is a bit positive. So in the raw data, viewing more lectures is actually beneficial, but when the total view time is being held constant, that's when we see this negative trend as illustrated. So this is then our main findings from the model, and obviously we've got two different variables that are together then influencing, seem to be the main influences on student performance, or associated, I should say. And so what I did then as a post hoc analysis to illustrate this, and to illustrate the interaction, if you will, between these two, the main two findings of the model, was to look then at the total view time per lecture. Okay, hopefully you can see that that is an amalgam of these two different variables. And then as a post hoc analysis, what I did was take a somewhat unusual step of then doing a post hoc analysis. And this is just essentially the data of the average view time minutes per lecture, post hoc data, and this is just a median split. So the median happened to be 83 minutes per lecture, so it's taking on the left hand side here their exam percentage versus for the lower half of the average minutes per lecture, and then on the right for the top half. And here's the same data but split into tertiles, so the middle third, top third, and the bottom third by average minutes per lecture, again as a post hoc only analysis, and that then gave us my biggest split of a sort of a variable, of taking multiple variables together. Now, a final thing, back to the total view duration. Because we've got multiple measures per student, 3 different separate independent exams, what this actually allowed me to do was look at the impact of between the student impact, which effectively that's asking the question, do students who usually watch more videos get higher grades? But it also allowed me to look within the same student, because they're taking 3 independent separate exams, is the within student deviation from their own mean. In other words, what happens if the same student, they have an average that they have been watching the lectures, and then for one of the exams, they have a big spike. They are watching more than usual for that particular exam. And in short, when we broke down the data in this way, the between student impact was bigger than the raw model data. Okay, it was suggesting not 1.7% per hour, but associated with a 2.5% increase in exam percent per hour of viewing. But then the within student impact was actually negative. In other words, that when students watched more than their own typical average, that was associated with a lower exam percentage. Now, obviously, I can only speculate and infer what this might represent, but I'm speculatively inferring that this is likely associated with cramming-like behaviour, that they're watching more than their typical, and that is that abnormality is leading then to that change in student behaviour is then associated with that lower exam grade. And then effectively, when we merge those two together, that hopefully you can see that that gives us our overall value from the model of our 1.7%. And so just to further, hopefully better illustrate what this is trying to represent, I just came up with this graph of effectively, and note this is really important to understand that this is just a hypothetical illustration of what that model data is trying to tell us. That for each student, okay, so the different shapes are just illustrating meant to illustrate a 5 different hypothetical students, okay, but each have their own typical exam average, okay? And in general, we see this association with the more viewing time, the higher exam percent between students. But when one individual student watches more than their own typical average, then they see a slight decrease, okay? And that's what the little dashed line is showing. The bigger dashed line is showing our plus 2.5%, and then our solid line is illustrating, again, for this hypothetical data set to illustrate the point, aggregate trend line of what we're seeing overall as a trend that the model is predicting. And so my interpretation of this is that, you know, lecture capture can be maybe a double-edged sword. And as Emily briefly mentioned in the introduction, I kind of view this through the theory of self-regulated learning, that with self-regulation or with higher self-regulation, that flexibility afforded by lecture capture can or may promote timely review and space consolidation. But for students maybe not without, and this was the one thing I did change in the updated slide set, but with lower self-regulation, lecture capture flexibility may increase the chance of procrastination, cramming, etc., that kind of behavior. And again, just to re-emphasize, I don't have direct data to say that that is what's happened. That is my speculation that I'm inferring from that the limited Zoom capture data I have. And so this then prompted me to come up with an actual more of a, not, I wouldn't say a randomized intervention, but a more quasi-interventional study where effectively now I was doing it for in total 4 biology courses, and exactly the same setup with our 3 different independent exams, with the in-person lectures and then the Zoom recordings. But the kicker here was that for the lecture blocks overall, for all 4 of the courses, only 50% of the lecture blocks of the lectures for the different exams were recorded and 50% were not recorded. So in any one course, there was either 1 lecture block recorded and 2 not recorded, or vice versa. But overall, in total, then we've got 50% of the lecture blocks recorded, 50% not. And then that allowed me to look at sort of both the impact of the lecture capture availability within the same course for the same students as those that are actually then looking at the exam impact or impact association, I should say, on exam percentage and performance. And so just for reference moving forward, I just referred to any of the exams where the lectures are available. I'm just referring to that as LC on and LC off for those when they're not available. Okay, then same viewing metrics. And I should note that I did obviously have to get REB approval, and this was all went through the ethical review board process. Now, 3 of the 4 courses within this cohort were 3rd-year courses, and 1 was a 1st-year course. And I bring this up because in this second study, what I noticed is that overall, same as in the first study and same that is broadly seen in the literature, when lecture videos are posted and made available, the majority of students use them. And that was overall within the data, that was the trend that I see, but hopefully you can appreciate here, we've got their 3rd years courses on the left here, and my 1 1st-year course on the right bucked that trend. The majority did not view the lecture videos, and this also was when I looked at the same data, but at the exam level rather than the student level, I saw that exact same trend. So in essence, I chose as my primary analysis, given that the first years seem to have a separate sort of viewing behavior with lecture videos, I chose to only use the analysis on the third year courses, and that is what I will show and represent. I would just note, though, that I also did do all the analysis of the entire data set, and in short, the entire data set is slightly different, but in essence, I see exactly the same trends as I will describe. Okay, so it didn't have a significant, huge impact on the overall data. Okay, so the first question then, this same initial question as I had in the prior study: when the lecture capture is available, do the students who view the lecture video have a different exam percent? So is there that same association with lecture capture viewing and actual exam performance? And overall, when we're looking at all the data together for all the exams, regardless of whether lectures were recorded or not, we saw this same general trend that in a similar ballpark, slightly lower value, but the viewers had a nearly 5% higher average exam grade than the non-viewers. Where things then what got really interesting for me, and what this sort of study design allowed, was then in those lecture sections or exams where the lectures were not recorded, okay, so there's no lectures recorded, there's no lectures posted, the students that when the videos were available, I can then still differentiate between the viewers within a course and the non-viewers. I still saw a significant difference between the viewers and the non-viewers, even when our lecture capture videos are not posted and not available. And so I take this as reasonably strong evidence that there is something inherently different within this study, at least, between those students that are actually taking advantage of lecture capture videos when they are available. Okay, and then in addition, then when I looked within the lecture capture, when the exam blocks, when the lecture capture was available, I saw an even bigger separation. And so this is not the strongest evidence, but obviously hints at potential that, again, consistent with some of the former data that I've shown you, the lecture capture viewing also can help some students as well. And this is effectively that same data for within those exam blocks when the lectures were recorded, what that general trend line was, and it's now 1.3% an hour, as opposed in the former study when it was 1.7% an hour. But in general, they're both consistent with this idea that both the lecture capture viewing is associated with a higher exam grade, but also reminder that there is at the same time likely something inherently different about those students that are taking advantage of the lecture capture videos when they are available. The final, but really to me interesting point around then what I could ask with this this more interventional study design was, what was the actual impact if I'm just comparing the overall exam grade between the lecture on blocks and the LC off blocks? What is the impact of that? And in short, this had a negative association of -6%. So overall, remember, within this model is holding all other values constant. And when all other values constant, which includes exam block and etc., I'm seeing a 6% drop in exam performance. In other words, this is when I'm making lecture captures available, that is having a negative impact on the students. Now, I really want to emphasize that obviously inherent within this design is the fact that we're covering different topics in the different lecture blocks. And even though the model is accounting and holding those constant, that could still be a significant confounding factor, that it could just be reflecting the topic or the difficulty of the topic. On that note, obviously, reminder that this is, we've got multiple courses, so that mitigates it to an extent, but it can't completely remove that could be due to a confounding variable of the difference in the lecture topics. One final thing on that, I sort of did do a secondary analysis to see if there was any significant difference in the difficulty, i.e. the overall exam grade between the LC on and LC off block exams, and there wasn't. So, but it's still possible that is a confounding variable there. Last point as well is that I also, in this second year, I did monitor attendance through an iClicker type question. And when I did this, there was no significant association with availability of the Zoom video having a significant impact on attendance directly. But what I did find that there was a higher attendance, that when there was higher attendance, okay, so we've got attendance as a percentage of the total course on the x-axis, and then the predicted exam percent by the model. So again here, if you look when LC is on, okay, when the lecture capture videos were made available, that gives us our lower percentage, but it is slightly mitigated by the increasing attendance, as you can see up the top of 100% attendance. Now, another fix that I made to the slides, and this is wrong version, this did not reach significance. So that is a typo here. So here is the modeling data for here. That interaction between the lecture capture availability and attendance, it trended towards that positive, but it did not reach significance. Okay, so it wasn't significant, but I still, from this data and from some of the other data and anecdotal observations, I still have a general view that attendance is an important factor within what's going on and impacting student behaviour. And so to wrap up then, my working hypothesis then is that lecture capture availability is associated with some change in student behaviour. And my best guess, if you will, is that this is creating a false sense of security when lectures are posted. They're more likely to skip the lecture, watch it later, backlog of lectures accumulate, and then they end up cramming, etc. And then the other bit of the data is that the ongoing in-person lecture attendance is likely mitigating some of this change in student behaviour, but also it's confounded a little bit because it may also be a proxy marker for self-regulated learners, those students that are attending in-person lecture, regardless of whether lecture capture is being made available or not. And so just to come back to our sort of double-edged sword again, what I'm speculating, what my ongoing hypothesis is that the in-person lecture attendance is kind of more associated with the higher self-regulation and the potential positive aspects of lecture capture, but making lecture captures available, at least in these courses, in this sort of 50-50 interventional kind of manner, is associated with sort of a lower impact or a worse impact of lecture capture. And so just to give very briefly, in the current year that we're currently academic year in, I'm essentially repeating this 50% availability, but I'm also now actually trying to incentivize lecture attendance by giving 5% for lecture attendance, which admittedly is going to also be another variable to change behavior. But the rationale for this in my mind is, again, going back to, I really want to still actually make lecture capture available to students, because I think there are benefits, and so I want to do that whilst trying to mitigate the risks, and so that's the approach I've taken. But obviously there are many other potential design implications here that I've just sort of put as a final sort of slide that maybe can be for discussion, and I think I'll leave it at that and be happy to take any questions as we go.
Thank you so much for this. And I think there are questions. I'm going to hand over to Emily to lead the Q&A for today's TILE seminar. So over to you, Emily.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks so much for that. I have so many opinions. I'm going to just shut up and ask all the questions that are in the chat. So one of the questions was from Emma, which was, do you set any expectations or give guidance to students about how lecture recordings should be used?
So I in short, no, because I consider that to be yet another behavioural variable if I introduce that could then influence student behaviour. So I didn't do that explicitly, but what I did do both of my current intervention year and the one that I just told you about, the former year, was essentially showed one slide showing the importance of the importance of lecture attendance in person. So I kind of did that because obviously I had to get the consent of the students, and so I had to tell them what I was doing and why I was doing it and the rationale. And so as part of that was an inherent difference within the 50-50 intervention design anyway. And so I took that as my baseline. I also then showed a graph looking at the relationship between attendance and lecture capture, but I'm sorry, attendance and exam performance, but I didn't explicitly give any instruction around lecture capture other than making students were told, and it was posted on the LMS exactly what lectures would be available. They knew right from the beginning of the course, or what lecture videos.
This question is kind of paraphrased from a couple of questions in the chat, and then also one of my own questions, which is about you've got that point there about timing and only making videos available for 1 week after a lecture. I've currently got I'm about to go and try and convince someone that withholding recordings until the end of term is the opposite of what one might want to do. And I just thought kind of, in terms of the timing and the release, you've already put that there, but given your results and so on, have you got any more additional thoughts on that about, if we're thinking about making them available, how long should we make them available for, and might that have differential effects on different groups of students?
Yeah, I'm very much a fence sitter on this issue, because I again, back to the sort of final point I made, I really want to still make lectures available and sort of as widely available. But when I start seeing some tentative evidence that it might actually be doing more harm, at least for some students, than good, then it's like, okay, so should I only make the lecture videos available for a week, as I said, as one potential suggestion? But then where I'm very conflicted is how much, the thing about leading a horse to water and you can't teach it to drink sort of thing, of how much should it be part of our jobs to actually try and deliberately, explicitly manipulate student behavior, versus how much should it be just sort of my other thing that I didn't like, was kind of tempted to do in the current academic year, was to show the students the data that I'd already got, to kind of, I'm relatively okay with that because, knowledge is power, etc. But I couldn't really do that, because then that would be yet another variable within my comparative groups that I didn't want to introduce. But certainly moving forward, I'm much more comfortable with sort of in the first lecture sharing some of my data and some of my experience with students, And I think that would probably, on reflection, be what I want to try first, to see if that had an impact on student behaviour, rather than trying to more directly force student behaviour. But I'm not ruling out either. But I think it's an interesting discussion.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of I think recording availability and attendance and self-regulation are often kind of like they're put together as if they're like, you know, if you change one, it would change the other, and so on. And when I'm being deliberately provocative and people are complaining about, you know, low attendance, my thing would be like, I stop recording everything. Do you think you're going to have 100%? Like, if you took away all the recordings, do you honestly think that class would be full? Like, I went to university before lecture recordings, and I can tell you I still miss my lectures to watch the afternoon showing of Neighbours. And there wasn't a record. So, you know, there's all these different variables, and it's that thing about, you know, it's all connected, but yeah. Let me just check the chat, because I'll just start going off on one. So if we want to encourage cramming, which we do, then doesn't delaying access to recordings risk encouraging it? Yes.
I don't want to encourage cramming. I'm not.
Sorry, if we want to discourage cramming.
Oh, discourage cramming. Then sorry, could you repeat the last bit of the question as well?
Sorry, it was just what we were discussing. So if we want to discourage cramming, which we do, then doesn't delaying access to recordings risk encouraging it? Which is, if you only make them available at the end of term, then essentially what?
Yeah, so I would definitely, if I was going to have some restriction on availability, I would do it much more that they're only available for 1 week after lecture, for example. But even that, like, can be problematic, because obviously it depends on the course schedule, etc. But it could be then that would further complicate it, because you could have an exam that is within 7 days of when the final lecture of that lecture block was, and so even that, then it starts getting a bit more complicated. But certainly, if I were to influence or modify the availability, that's kind of what I'm thinking. But again, it's not my initial next plan.
And then, so there's a question from Chris earlier on. So it's with the students who were watching more than the predicted norm, so the ones who were watching more than was usual for themselves, was that all happening within the 3-day window before the exam? Do you know?
Yes.
Yeah. So when they were watching more than they normally would, that was like in the moment.
Yeah. Now, but again, it didn't really come out as a significant factor in the model, that timing. But again, I think that's because the majority of all students of all viewing behaviour were watching it on the day of or the day before the exam, and so it was difficult then to tease out what was reflective of true last-minute cramming than when they hadn't been attending lecture, which I wasn't tracking in that first year of the study, versus a student that was just sort of checking a point for, you know, that they wanted to review that they weren't clear on within a particular lecture, and had higher viewing because of that behaviour. And so obviously that is something that would be ideal to be able to monitor, but I just don't have that data or insight.
Yeah. So there's a question just come in from Loic. So did you differentiate active teaching from playing lectures? So watching a video and lecture passively, or a similar experience? Why would you watch a lecture if you can attend an interactive learning event?
No, so in general, obviously, the Zoom viewing metrics are great for what they are, but they are limited in that, you know, it could be just that's playing to no one watching. It doesn't measure any matter of engagement. And so that's obviously an inherent limitation within the data that I have available. And then sort of coupled with that, in that the study that the 24-25 data with the interventional study, I did track attendance, but it was an imperfect measure, because it was a there was no grades associated with it. So it was just kind of a voluntary, I click a question that most students did respond to, but I know that it wasn't perfect either. And so in that study, because I wasn't incentivizing attendance, I know that the attendance data was imperfect. In the current year, because I am now incentivizing lecture attendance, again, 5% as my sort of minor grade incentive, that I'm much more certain of the actual reliability of the attendance data, which will hopefully then give me within the model, it will come out as a more accurate predictor of different things, and would allow me at least to then be more sure of being able to try and link attendance with that sort of more last minute viewing behavior. But again, because I can't see whether students, how they're really engaged in the video, I am inherently limited in what I can infer from that.
Yeah, so I'm just trying to keep up with the chat. There's a lot going on, trying to pick out the questions. So there's another comment from Chris, because it was something that I picked on as well. So I was very interested to see that the majority of first year students didn't watch the lecture captures. I wonder if this is seen more widely, and if so, when is best to engage students to educate them and using lecture capture efficiently. My take, so I wonder if you agree with this, which is that, is it that the first year students are more likely to not watch them and say they don't go, oh, I'll watch them later, and they don't, whereas at least the third years they go, oh, I'll watch it later, and they do. So that the initial intention is maybe the same in first and third year, but the third years follow. Like, have you got any sense of why you might get that difference?
So I agree with that sort of interpretation, with also the addition that I just know for that particular one first year course. First of all, I think it's important to note that it was in the fall semester, so it was, or autumn semester, so it was like the first year, first course, so everyone's a lot keener, which I know then that I had the data that the even though it's imperfect, that the lecture attendance in that first year course in person was higher and remained higher than in the third years, because they're sort of first year keeners, etc. And so that's another potential variable within that. And I included that first year class or course within my current analysis that I have the data for, but I just have not looked at whether I'm seeing that same trend in the first year again repeated this year or not. But obviously I'll be able to look into that moving forward.
Yes. I'm conscious of the time, and I'm trying to I'm going to pick up one more question. There's a bunch of others in the chat, but just from Brenda, it was just about the attendance thing, because I'm also interested in this that you've mentioned. So you're talking about getting a 5% grade for attendance. When do they get that? Is it they have 100% attendance? Is it above 95? Are there a threshold or something? How are you implementing that?
So I actually had a very long conversation with ChatGPT about what the best way to structure that was. And what we collectively came up with, that I am now owning and implementing, is essentially they have to attend. It's not a linear scale. I mean, overall, if they attend all the lectures, then yes, that's obviously they get the 5%, but they can miss up to if they attend 9 or 10 of the lectures, they get 100%. So there's some flexibility. If they attend 8 lectures, they get like 4.5%. 7 lectures, 4%. But then it ramps down very quickly, such that, if they only watch or attend 2 of the lectures, they get 0. If they attend 3 of the lectures, they get 0.5%. So it's deliberately structured so that there's some flexibility, but in order to get a passing grade, they have to at least attend sort of 6 or 7 lectures, something in that range. So yeah. That's how I structured it. Again, trying to encourage routine attendance and not give away grades just for attending a couple of lectures. That's not going to get you anything.
Yeah. Thank you so much. There's still more in the chat, but I'm conscious of time. But so I will maybe. You should get a copy of the chat afterwards. And so on. Colin, was that a raised hand to say something, or was that just an applause? I'm going to assume that it was applause.
I'm happy to stay on if others are. I don't have any pressing engagements coming up in the next little while.
That's super kind of you. However, I do have an
yeah, that's right.
And first of all, I would like thank you so much, Emily, for guiding us through the Q&A, and thank you, Kirk, for your talk and for sharing your research. And you can see from the chat that there are more questions. People are really engaged and interested, so that's great. I hope they all watch the recording again, you know, as a space practice approach. We will put the recording on our Tile Network website, and with your slides as well and your contact details, so if people have more questions they can ask and so on. The chat will remain active as far as I know and understand, Teams.
Okay.
So you can actually answer questions in the chat as well, and people will see that.
Okay.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. It was a wonderful Tile Network seminar today, and have a good rest of your week. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.